It's Tuesday, the 16th September 2025. A quick look at some of the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. We begin with the Punch newspaper. The leading story says, food price crash. Farmers fault federal government order as agro imports hit 2.2 trillion naira. The complete story can be found on page 24 of the Punch newspaper. And above that story says, Presidency fires back as 𝐒𝐞𝐞 warns of revolution. The complete story can be found on page 21 of the Punch newspaper. Tinubu, Fubara and foreign trips. 𝐒𝐨 set for handover. The complete story can be found on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. FX influx. Reserves boost naira to 1,497 naira per dollar. The complete story can be found on page 23 of the Punch newspaper. SANU, NASU issues strike notice over unpaid allowances. The complete story can be found on page 21 of the Punch newspaper. And below the leading story says, Dangote vows refinery won't fall to oil mafia. The complete story can be found on page 23 of the Punch newspaper. And below that story says, South is behind as Southwest maintain voter pre-registration lead. The complete story can be found on page 7 of the Punch newspaper. Nepal protest. 2 Nigerian inmates arrested after jailbreak. The complete story can be found on page 4 and 5 of the Punch newspaper. Federal government suspends controversial 4% import duty levy. The complete story can be found on page 23 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to Vanguard, we have bandits adopt 40 in Zamfara mosque as peace deal collapses. The complete story can be found on page 5 of the Vanguard. And above that story says, our plant ended 50 years of fuel queues in Nigeria, Dangote refinery. The complete story can be found on page 20 of the Vanguard. No glitches, no excuses. PDP warns INEC on 2027. The complete story can be found on page 48 of the Vanguard. Inflation rate drops to 20.14% in August. The complete story can be found on page 19 of the Vanguard. My achievements will speak for me in 2027, says Governor Idris. The complete story can be found on page 47 of the Vanguard. And below the leading story from the left. Presidency, 𝐒𝐞𝐞 bicker over hunger. Looming revolution claims. The complete story can be found on page 8 of the Vanguard. ADC to court. You have no power to sack Mark-led 𝐒𝐨. The complete story can be found on page 9 of the Vanguard. NAS to Natasha. Allow Senate. Courts play constitutional roles. The complete story can be found on page 8 of the Vanguard. 2009 agreement. SANU, NASU to shut down varsities September 22. The complete story can be found on page 48 of the Vanguard. And in sports, we have, it's all God, Amusan on winning silver at 2025 World Cup Championship. The complete story can be found on page 55 of the Vanguard. Tinubu cut 10-day vacation, returns to Abuja today. The complete story can be found on page 48 of the Vanguard. 70 CSOs to NAS. Summon 𝐒𝐨s to give account in Rivers. The complete story can be found on page 14 of the Vanguard. Moving over to Nigerian Tribune. The leading story says, 2027. PDP demands legal backing for electronic transmission of results. The complete story can be found on page 15 of the Nigerian Tribune. And above that story says, Nigeria's inflation rate dropped to 20.12% in August, says NBS. The complete story can be found on page 5 of the Nigerian Tribune. Guinness Book of World Record confirms Hilda Bassi's largest saving of Nigeria. Guinness Book of World Records confirms Hilda Baci's largest serving of Nigeria. The complete story can be found on page 21 of the Nigerian Tribune. And below the leading story from the left. Move to reduce federal government stake in joint oil venture capable of undermining Nigeria's sovereignty, Atiku warns. The complete story can be found on page 6 of the Nigerian Tribune. Oyo launches Sustainable Social Protection Initiative. The complete story can be found on page 17 of the Nigerian Tribune. I can't facilitate Natasha's resumption, says CNA. The complete story can be found on page 3 of the Nigerian Tribune. Our refinery ended Nigeria's 50-year fuel queues crisis, says Dangote. The complete story can be found on page 14 of the Nigerian Tribune. Moving over to The Guardian, the leading story says, money illusion fuels fiscal crisis as state debt deficit soar. The complete story can be found on page 6 of The Guardian. And above that story from the right, how our refinery saved Nigeria's oil sector, says Dangote. The complete story can be found on page 3 of The Guardian. Federal government suspends custom FOB levy on imports. The complete story can be found on page 4 of The Guardian. 2027. Nigerians won't accept technical glitch excuses. PDP warns INEC. The complete story can be found on page 3 of The Guardian. And below the leading story from the left. International Day. Nigeria democracy faces grave threats from hunger, corruption, Atiku, CSOs warn. The complete story can be found on page 6 of The Guardian. Stable exchange rate, food prices drive down inflation to 20.12%. The complete story can be found on page 15 of The Guardian. NMA rejects salary cut for Lagos doctors, faults federal government on funding. The complete story can be found on page 5 of The Guardian. Adeleke devastated, laments as flood ravages Osun community. The complete story can be found on page 5 of The Guardian. Peace deal collapses as bandits adopt 40 in Zamfara. The complete story can be found on page 29 of The Guardian. Moving over to the last paper on the list, Daily Trust. The leading story says, amid peace deal in Katsina, bandits adopt 55 in Zamfara. The complete story can be found on page 3 and 4 of the Daily Trust. And above that story says, presidency, Atiku trade words over hunger, poverty. The complete story can be found on page 28 of the Daily Trust. 3 patients die at AKTH as 𝐒𝐞𝐽 cuts power over debt. The complete story can be found on page 33 of the Daily Trust. Mafias out to kill my refinery, says Dangote. The complete story can be found on page 23 of the Daily Trust. And below the leading story says, FCT doctors strike, services grounded in hospitals. The complete story can be found on page 6 of the Daily Trust. And below that story says, Tinubu cut short vacation, returns to Nigeria today. The complete story can be found on page 10 of the Daily Trust. 2027. UN warns parties against hate speech. The complete story can be found on page 33 of the Daily Trust. Kano Maradi Rail project at 60% completion, says President. The complete story can be found on page 25 of the Daily Trust. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper to read the complete story.